All right, y'all, let's jump right in. We just spent a really, really long time doing a survey of the Old Testament and then talked about the time between the Testaments. So now we're going to jump into our survey of the New Testament. And of course, by the New Testament, we're talking about those collection of writings that deal specifically with the life of Jesus and the birth and really infancy of the early church, the earliest days of the church and the beginning of the mission movement. Why are Christians more familiar with the New Testament than the Old Testament? By the way, who says they are? Well, I do. But why? Huh?
It's easier for me to read.
Why is it easier for you to read?
Because it doesn't have all that other stuff.
What other stuff?
All that hard to pronounce stuff, all that just.
Hard to pronounce stuff?
Leviticus, we just finished.
Leviticus, yeah.
Really?
I'm always so glad every year when I get past Leviticus 15, bodily emissions. I just kind of speed read it. Why else? Why are we more familiar with the New Testament? It's got the gospel in it. We really like the stuff about Jesus and the church. I mean, and for that makes it easier to read too. I mean, there's stuff there we can identify with more easily than we can identify with all the kings and the prophets and all that stuff going on that day. It's closer to home, you know. It reads different, and it's, I mean, we're Christians, and it deals with, you know, like I said, the birth of the church and the life of Jesus. But there's two realities. One reality is that a knowledge of the Old Testament leads to a better understanding of the New Testament. And that's so for a lot of reasons. I mean, the New Testament quotes the Old Testament a lot. Not only does it quote the Old Testament, but it references the Old Testament. It alludes to the Old Testament and the practices of the Old Testament. If you know the Old Testament, you're going to understand the dynamic between the Jews and the Gentiles better. You're going to understand a lot of the dynamic with the worship and the temple and stuff going on there. It helps you understand the history and the hope for the Messiah. So a knowledge of the Old Testament helps us get a better understanding of the New Testament, but an understanding of the New Testament also helps us get a better understanding of the Old Testament. So they go hand in hand. They really do. And the more I study the Old Testament, the more I understand the New Testament. And the more I study the New Testament, the more I understand the Old Testament. And the reason that is because the Old Testament's ultimately about Jesus. So it's like you read the Old Testament, and a lot of that stuff you're like, yeah, that's just ancient history stuff. And then you start reading the New Testament, and you're going, so that's what that was about. I didn't know. And it makes things so much more clearly, or much more clear. So as we begin looking at the New Testament, we're going to just consider some of the contextual matters before we jump into, you know, our overview of the various books. And the first thing we want to consider is just the geography. Now, in one respect, it's mostly the same geography as the Old Testament. There's a lot of overlap. In the New Testament, we don't get a lot of Egypt. We don't get Babylon. But and in the New Testament, we go further west. We go into Europe. We go into Rome, and so we see some of that. And so. And the empires, the kings, and all that are different. So if you think about it, though, the Old Testament covered a time period of about 3,600 years. And the New Testament covers a time period of about 100 years. So there's going to be less change and dynamic in the geopolitical landscape. I thought this was a decent map I just found on the internet. And so, you know, when I read the Bible, I'm all the time looking at the maps. I'm all the time pulling up the maps, and it just really helps me to see where things are. And so I know you've probably seen a lot of these things, but a lot of these places are mentioned in the New Testament. It helps me just to get a visual on them. When we talk about Judea, we're talking about this more southern part of Israel, or this Palestinian region that was called Palestine at the time. Syro-Phoenicia is up there. So like you see where Caesarea Philippi and Damascus are, that's modern day Syria. And then you see over here where Tyre and Sidon are, that's modern day Lebanon. And then the rest of this would be Israel and the Palestinian territories. And you can see some of the places that you read about in the New Testament. You see Bethsaida up here on the east side of the Sea of Galilee. You see Chorazin and Capernaum and Tiberias and Cana and Nazareth, Caesarea. So these are familiar terms if you read the New Testament. Then you see the area of the Samaritans and their capital, Samaria. And getting a phone call. And then further south, you know, Jericho and Bethany. Idumea. Anybody have any idea where that name comes from? Edom. Okay, so this is where the Edomites were. And then the Nabateans over here ended up conquering the Idumeans. And this down here, all of this over here is the nation of Jordan. And over here, this is all the Sinai Peninsula that belongs to Egypt. And so they kind of parallel each other all the way down to the Gulf of Aqaba. And you see Bethany east of the Jordan. I don't know how many of you have been to Israel? Have any of you been over there? So there's they tell you about two potential sites. We've been to both of them, potential sites for the baptism of Jesus, because nobody really knows. Sort of the more popular site where you see all, you know, it's just big tourist area and everything, is up here south of Tiberias, like right by the Sea of Galilee. But when we were in Jordan, we actually went down here to Bethany east of the Jordan and watched people across the way being baptized. And over here, you actually have a monastery and a couple of churches named after John the Baptist, because we read that this is the area that John the Baptist was living in the wilderness. And it's really interesting to be there and you look, and honestly, just the mental picture I get from John the Baptist, you look around the wilderness and you see the caves up there in the rocks and you're like, yeah, this looks exactly like where John the Baptist would live. So whether Jesus was down there when he got baptized or not, we don't really know. Then to zoom out a little bit, we've got the Roman world. And you can see on the legend on this map, the red line says the Roman Empire at its greatest extent, 117. But all the area that's in green, you can see that's the growth of Christianity during the first century. It's really remarkable. They were on foot for most of this. I mean, there were some boats involved, but they were mostly on foot sharing the gospel. And then the growth of Christianity during the second century. And you can see how, really, that's a rapid spread without any kind of modern technology or travel or anything. And so you see up here, Asia and Galatia, this is the region we would call Asia Minor, which is modern day Turkey. And then over here, this region of Achaia, this is all modern day Greece that encompasses Thessalonica and Philippi and goes right up to the border of Turkey. And that's the Aegean Sea there, of course. But you remember when Paul was on his second missionary journey, he's on the west coast over here in the city of Troas, and he gets this vision from a man of Macedonia. So Macedonia in old times is in Greece now. There's actually a country called North Macedonia. It's a little north of there, but he goes over to Neapolis and Philippi and Thessalonica and Berea, which is now part of Greece. And then you can see where Italy and Rome are there. So, you know, again, I don't know if it helps you or not, but it helps me just to get a mental picture and understand what they're talking about and where they're going. Any questions just about the geography of any of this? Probably not. But. All right. Next, we're going to get into one of my absolute favorite topics to discuss. We cannot get into all the dynamics, but we're going to talk about some of the cultural dynamics that were at play. I do want to talk about some of them because I think it's going to be helpful. It really helps me, especially reading the Gospels, to understand some of these things. Because let's just be honest, you know, I was reading something the other day and a guy said, well, I read the Bible without any preconceptions whatsoever. And I'm like, no, you don't. You can't erase your mind. You can't erase your experiences and your knowledge and your understanding. And the reality is we read the Bible through a 21st century Western lens, which means some of the stuff there is a little foreign to us, and some of their cultural practices and their ideology is just different to us. And maybe we're reading it even through a 20th century lens. I actually, I didn't come to Christ till 87, and it took me a little while before I even started studying the Bible. But some of you, maybe most of your life was in the 20th century. And so, things change and culture changes, and those shape how we read it. And that's just a reality, and we're just best off acknowledging that. Because when we acknowledge it, then we can figure out how to deal with it and get to what the text is saying. Some of these cultural dynamics that I'm going to talk about are so foreign to us. I mean, you're going to hear about some of these things, and it's just going to seem like, man, that's just wild. But bear in mind, there are parts of the world where these are very much still in play. In fact, when I was in the PhD program, there were several Korean students in the PhD program. And when we would talk about some of these cultural dynamics, it was real to them because they are still in play in Asia. And so they understand, like one of the ones we're going to talk about is honor and shame. And it's not like what we think of when we think of honor and shame. And they get this. They get how you can do something and bring shame onto your whole family and be outcast and things like that on a much different level than any of us would ever experience. And when we look at them, we're going to look at 5 particular things. And what I don't want to do is put these out there like these are 5 completely disconnected things, because they're all intertwined. Everything is a part of everything else. I mean, it's that way in our culture, everything we believe, think, do, it's all connected to everything else. And so we're just going to look at 5 of these things. And the first of these is religion. I'm not going to spend a lot of time here because, for one thing, last time I talked about the 5 different political movements within Judaism itself in the first century and what was going on with Second Temple Judaism. So I don't want to rehash that. Those of you that weren't here, that video is out there on the YouTube channel, so you can watch that as well. But a bigger picture of the religious culture of the area, and it's a mixed bag. And, something we need to realize is obviously you've got the Jews there in Palestine, and Jerusalem was their religious center. But remember, they had started building synagogues after the Babylonian captivity. So in all their towns, they started building the synagogues. So this is still a fairly modern movement for them. And what's happening is even the Jews that were scattered around, Paul goes up into that Asia Minor area and he's going to the synagogues in these towns and he's preaching. So these are scattered all around, all about pagan Rome. So you go into these towns, they've got all these pagan temples, and a Jewish synagogue was just one of the things that they did. Messianic hope was really significant, and because Messianic hope was significant, there were a lot of false messiahs at the time. I mean, they were so many of them. People that came on the scene preaching, claiming to be the Messiah. And they would, just like cults today, these false preachers, we have them all the time, don't we? They come on the scene, they get a following, and the crazy thing, I think, always to me, is when they're proven not to be who they say they are, they keep their following. And I don't really get that dynamic, but that is something that happens. You also had converts to Judaism. You had Jewish proselytes. You had people convert to Judaism, so Gentiles who became Jews. And then you had what are called the God-fearers. So God-fearers are people who did not convert to Judaism. They didn't go all the way. They didn't undergo circumcision. But they liked the monotheism. They liked the idea that there was one God. And they liked the morality of Judaism, because bear in mind, these pagan religions didn't have the idea that, hey, you should be married to one person. You shouldn't sleep around outside of marriage. You shouldn't be getting drunk. They didn't have this, and there's something appealing to that to some people that caused them to want to take part, at least to some extent, with what the Jews believed. Now, bear in mind, they were not allowed to go into the temple areas. They weren't allowed any of that, but you see some of these people in the scripture that are God-fearers. Then, of course, you've got the Samaritans, and the Samaritans come from the people that had intermingled, the Jews that had intermarried, rather, with people from other backgrounds. After Assyria conquered the northern kingdom in 722 BC, that instead of deporting them like the Babylonians did, they just took everybody back to Babylon with them. But what they did is they brought some of their own people in to the northern kingdom, and then they took Jews and they scattered them around in their own towns. So what happened is the people that still wanted to keep their distinctiveness, even though they may not be purebred Jews anymore, they still wanted to keep this worship. What they did is they ended up settling primarily in Samaria, and they had their worship there on Mount Gerizim. That was the place, and they only accepted the first 5 books of the Bible. And they are still there today. You can Google Samaritans, and you can see pictures of their priests in their white robes making sacrifices, and they've got the animals splayed out and doing things like that. I mean, they're still doing their things to this day, which I find very interesting. And bear in mind, the Samaritans and the Jews did not like each other. The Samaritans thought they were right, and the Jews thought they were corrupt, and that they had corrupted the true religion, and they worshiped in the wrong place. And there was great animosity between Jews and Samaritans. And of course, they still don't like each other today. And that's just one of the realities that you see. And then, of course, there were pagans. And, we think about like when they go outside of Palestine, when they go out into Asia Minor, you expect to see these cities with idols. In fact, when Paul goes into Athens, he talks about how his spirit was provoked within him because of the number of gods. And one ancient historian from that period, it may have been Josephus, actually said there were more gods in Athens than people. They had so many, and they even had an altar to an unknown god. So they wanted to make sure they had all their bases covered. But there was also pagan worship going on in the Palestinian region. Because this was Roman territory, Herod was a builder. Herod the Great was a builder, and he built a lot of cities. And these were Roman cities that he built. Now, they may have had a synagogue, Jews may have lived there, but he built Roman cities, and there was this Roman culture, and you didn't see the cities there that had the multi-temples to the pagan gods, but there was the pagan worship going on around there as well. And so what you have is in the first century, you've got the church exploding in this predominantly Jewish, but also very pluralistic pagan culture that they're going out into. A second dynamic that you're probably at least somewhat familiar with, especially who was reading in Leviticus recently? Y'all are reading in Leviticus, yeah. So there's a lot of stuff about being clean and unclean, about being pure and impure, and the idea of purity is not unique to Jews. In fact, all that ancient ancient Near Eastern culture, all of these cultures had these ideas of ritualistic purity and community purity and things like that. And so with the Jews, you've got these ritual impurities that you read about in the law, like if you do this, you're unclean and you got to do this, and you're unclean until nightfall, or you're unclean until you go through these rituals, and there are various things that you have to do. But these impurities brought hard boundaries in respect to both religion and relationships. And so to do something that renders you unclean is something that was very costly to you. And it could have you cut off from your family, it could have you cut off from your friends, it could have you put completely outside the camp, completely outside the city. You couldn't participate in worship. In fact, if you were unclean and you dared to go into the temple, they believed that God would just strike you dead. So there was this fear of God from being unclean. It was a big deal. I'm preaching this Sunday on Jesus healing a leper in Luke chapter 5, verses 12 through 16. And Kobe was in my office today, and I told him, I said, man, every time I study this week, I get teary-eyed because of this leper. And I'm going to talk more about this Sunday, but if you'll notice, one of the things he says when he comes to Jesus, he asks if Jesus will make him clean. He doesn't ask Jesus to heal him. Now, I mean, obviously to be clean, he's got to be healed. But his greatest concern is not the disease, it's the uncleanness. Because he's cut off. He's cut off from people, he's cut off from God. And he wants to be made clean again. And so, if you read Leviticus, there are a lot of things that could make you ritually unclean. Sickness or infirmity could render, you could be considered unclean. Your ethnic identity, the Jews saw the Samaritans as unclean. Certain sins would make you unclean. Touching unclean things could make you unclean. This is why people were upset. Let me back up. This is one of the reasons, remember, all these things are intertwined, but one of the reasons, part of the dynamic, that people would get upset with Jesus. Why is he eating with those kind of people? Why is he eating with sinners? Because they're not clean. He's not supposed to be hanging out with them. And this also has to do with honor and shame, which we'll get to in just a minute. But bear in mind, if you were ritually impure, unclean, the reason they were so serious about you staying away is because if you came in contact with somebody who was unclean, their uncleanness was transferred to you. You also became unclean. And that was a very real danger. Man, I had contact with a leper. I can't worship anymore, and I got to get out of here until I prove that I'm okay. So it was a big deal. Another one of the dynamics, I won't spend a lot of time on this, is just the social strata, because it was different than what we think of today in our culture where we've got, we talk about the lower classes, the middle class, the upper middle class, the upper class, and we sort of have these categories that we put people in, whether those are helpful or not. We think that way. We've been cultured to think that way. But they didn't think in ways of you fit here, here, here. Instead of categories, it was more of a spectrum. And this spectrum not only had to do with how much money you had, but it could have to do with who your connections were, what family you were from. And so people were all along this socioeconomic spectrum, and could have to do with, they did have like a ruling class, but that had to do more with position and power than anything. And so talking about the social strata, I really want to segue into these next two, because these two next ones are major factors. And I hope, I'm going to spend 20 minutes on these two things when really we could spend 20 weeks on them, but we're not going to do that. But I hope just this little bit will help you start, and I'm going to give you a couple of examples from Scripture to help you start to see some of the dynamic that is going on. So, honor and shame. So everyone in the community had a certain degree of honor. Now, it could be like no honor. That's a degree of honor. Or it could be a lot of honor. But again, we're talking spectrums here, okay? And it was assigned by your community. Like you just didn't get to pick your honor. You didn't get to say, well, I have this kind of job, so I am at this point on the spectrum. And people did, when I say it was assigned by community, it's not like the community got together and said, okay, you fit here. It was just the way you were permitted access, business, the way that you interacted with people, the amount of respect that you got from others or didn't get from others. And there were a lot of factors, character, behavior, your status, what you could do for people, who you knew, who you were related to. Everyone had a certain degree of honor and or shame, and everybody wanted more honor. So how did you lose honor? Well, there were several ways, and I'm going to camp out in a little bit on one of them. But if you do something immoral, you can dishonor yourself. You can bring shame or disgrace to yourself. If you have some sort of behavior within the community, you can disgrace yourself. And here's the deal, that would attach to your family as well. So remember, community in these cultures is a really big deal. Family is a really big deal. If you associate with the wrong person, again, Jesus hanging out with tax collectors, sinners, prostitutes, that right there will get you knocked down to the bottom. I mean, that brings shame and disgrace in the eyes of the community on it. So, like the Pharisees would see Jesus doing that, and they're like, this guy's a rabbi. He can't go eat with these people? Because eating with somebody, that was like a big deal too. Sitting down at the table with somebody. That's not just like doing business. Meals were very intimate, very personal. And why is he doing that? He's disgracing himself. And you can see where this would be a conundrum for his followers. A lot of times you see his followers kind of stand back, like when his disciples come up and when they go through Samaria and they're at the well, and the disciples go to get food, and they come back and Jesus is talking to this Samaritan woman, and it says they stop and they're talking to each other like, what's he doing? They're confused because this is the rabbi. And why is he disgracing himself like this? Because that's also going to affect their honor and their shame. This is one of the reasons following Jesus was so costly, because Jesus was doing things that in culture brought shame upon himself and by association his disciples. So if they're going to follow Jesus, they got to realize they're going to be mistreated. People are going to look down at them. How did you gain honor? Well, you could gain honor by doing things for people or by doing something for the community. And in the last factor that I'll talk about, the number 5 thing, we'll talk more about how that works. But I want to talk about one particular way that you could either gain or lose honor, and they had these things called honor challenges. So there's such a thing as an honor challenge. And the way an honor challenge worked, well, there are several ways, really. But I mean, there's sort of a basic template of how this worked. But I guess the reason an honor challenge, if you believed that you should get more honor than you have, then you would make an honor claim. Now, an honor claim could be you making a statement to the effect that you deserve a certain degree of honor. Or it could be that you do something to demonstrate that you should have honor. Remember when Jesus rebuked people for going to a dinner party and going and sitting at the higher seats? You're going and sitting in a position, because every seat at a dinner party had a level of honor assigned to it, a level of importance. And so one way you could claim honor for yourself is bump yourself up a seat or two. And one way you could be really disgraced is if you were told to move. Then that would not only just put you back where you belong, but that lowered your status. So a person could make an honor claim. Now, a person might make an honor claim and everybody just says, yeah, we're good with that. Or it could be challenged. So step 1 is a claim, step 2 is a challenge. So the challenge is, I think you're in my seat. Or you make a statement that you believe you deserve certain honor, and somebody says, prove it. Or tell me why you deserve that honor. So there's a claim, then there's a challenge. Now the challenge has to be followed with the technical term is a riposte, R-I-P-O-S-T-E, a riposte or a response. There has to be a response to this challenge. You make a claim, somebody says, hey, you're in my seat. Well, let me tell you why I'm in this seat. Here's why I think I should be here. And then there is a verdict. Who decides the verdict? Everybody standing around watching. They get to decide who wins the challenge. So to challenge someone's honor claim also was risky, because there's always a winner and there's always a loser. And the winner always gains honor, and the loser always has shame. So if you're going to make an honor claim, you better be willing to back it up. And if you're going to challenge somebody's honor, you better be sure you're going to win. So let me give you an example from Scripture. I'm going to take two passages from Luke. I've been spending a lot of time in Luke, and so you'll get these in greater detail. Luke 13, verses 10 through 17. Now he was teaching in one of the synagogues on the Sabbath, and behold, there was a woman who had a disabling spirit for 18 years. She was bent over and could not fully straighten herself. When Jesus saw her, he called her over and said to her, "Woman, you are freed from your disability." That's an honor claim. What's the claim? He's claiming, I can do something about this. He laid his hands on her. Immediately she was made straight and she glorified God. But the ruler of the synagogue, he's about to lay down a challenge. The ruler of the synagogue, indignant because Jesus had healed on the Sabbath, said to the people, now bear in mind, Jesus is doing over this, and he doesn't address Jesus, he's challenging publicly. He says to the people, there are 6 days in which work ought to be done. Come on those days and be healed, and not on the Sabbath day. Claim by something he did. Challenge, how's Jesus going to respond to that? I mean, the ruler of the synagogue's got him dead to rights. You broke the Sabbath, buddy. He's feeling pretty good about himself right now. Then comes the riposte. The Lord answered him, "You hypocrites." By the way, that's strong. Does not each of you on the Sabbath untie his ox or his donkey from the manger and lead it away to water it? And ought not this woman, a daughter of Abraham, whom Satan bound for 18 years, be loosed from this bond on the Sabbath day? So what's he doing? He's not just giving a rationale. He's saying, you break the Sabbath. You loosen your ox or your donkey on the Sabbath. You're doing that. Can't I loosen this woman bound by Satan? Here's the verdict, verse 17. As he said these things, all his adversaries were put to shame. And all the people rejoiced at all the glorious things that were done by him. This was bad for that synagogue ruler and everybody on his side, because now they have a lower standing and less respect in their town. But Jesus is the hero. Who makes him the hero? All the people standing around. Now, this is what we call a negative honor challenge. In other words, someone is directly trying to bring Jesus down. So it's called a negative honor challenge. There are also positive honor challenges. So a positive honor challenge is not, so a negative honor challenge is pugilistic. I mean, we're going to fight here. A positive honor challenge is not meant for that, but it's also risky. For example, in my sermon this week, the leper says to Jesus, "Lord, if you will, you can make me clean." Well, he's not challenging Jesus. He wants to be made clean. What he's doing is he's expressing his belief that, and he's doing this publicly, his belief that Jesus can do something for him here. So he is ascribing honor to Jesus. It's a challenge because now Jesus has to back it up. Can he make him clean or can't he? Will he make him clean or won't he? So Jesus is on the spot. Either he can or he can't. And you'll have to come Sunday to find out if he can or not. The last, and tied to this, is patronage. Patronage is a big deal because virtually every relationship you had not your immediate family. Outside of your immediate family, virtually every relationship you had was transactional. It was a quid pro quo. I do something for you, you do something for me. Seneca was a first century Roman philosopher. He actually said that this whole system of patronage, he said, is, quote, the chief bond of human society. It is how society worked in Jesus' day. Now, we're going to look at a passage first, and then I'll come back and explain the patronage at work. This is from Luke 7, beginning in verse 1. After he'd finished all his sayings in the hearing of the people, he entered Capernaum. Now a centurion had a servant who was sick and at the point of death, who was highly valued by him. When the centurion heard about Jesus, he sent to him elders of the Jews, asking him to come and heal his servant. When they came to Jesus, they pleaded with him earnestly, saying, "He is worthy to have you do this for him, for he loves our nation, and he is the one who built us our synagogue." And Jesus went with them. When he was not far from the house, the centurion sent friends, saying to him, "Lord, do not trouble yourself, for I am not worthy to have you come under my roof. Therefore I did not presume to come to you, but say the word, and let my servant be healed. For I too am a man set under authority with soldiers under me, and I say to one, go, and he goes, and to another, come, and he comes, and to my servant, do this, and he does it." When Jesus heard these things, he marveled at him, and turning to the crowd that followed him, said, "I tell you, not even in Israel have I found such faith." And when those who had been sent returned to the house, they found the servant well. So there's some dynamics going on. There's a lot of dynamics in this passage. Patrons. Patrons were people in a position to do something for someone else. So a patron is somebody who did favors and granted access. This was a big deal. See, and this is one reason we have a hard time with this. I mean, there are some things you can't access to, but like basic services, if you need to renew your driver's license, nobody is more important than anybody else. You don't have to know somebody down at the DMV to get your driver's license. But if you needed basic services, a lot of times you had to know somebody who knew somebody in order to get those services. So people who had ability to help others out would do this for others, and these others were referred to as clients. So they are their clients. Sometimes they are called their friends, depending on the situation. I'll get to that too. So there are different kinds of patrons. There are benefactors, and benefactors who are those who are actually like dipping into their own pockets to do something for somebody. They're buying something for someone. They are literally giving something tangible to somebody. And it could be personal or it could be public. Think about this passage. The elders come and say, "This guy built us our synagogue. He's a patron for the town. He's a patron for the Jews in the town. So he's done something for them, and since he's done something for them, they owe him." Now, he doesn't say, "I'll build your synagogue, but you're going to owe me." In fact, you can have a completely benevolent patron who he doesn't want anything in return. I'm going to build your synagogue. But then he also knows if I need something, I can go to the elders, I can go to the leaders of the synagogue, and I can get what I need. At dinner parties, there's also something called brokers. So patrons are people who gave something. Brokers are people who made connections. Now, these are two kinds of patrons. So you got patrons that are benefactors, patrons that are brokers. And I mean, one guy can be multi. So the broker is the person that introduces you to somebody. The broker is the person that does get you the access. The broker is the person that says, "Oh, I see you need that. I know a guy who can do that for you." So he's brokering a relationship so that you can have access to somebody. Or you go to your patron and you say, "Hey, I know you know this guy. is there any way you can get me in with him? And so he can do that. At dinner parties, you only invited people to dinner parties who could do something for you in return. So you would invite your patrons to dinner parties. That's one of the things, is if you're a patron for somebody, you expect to get invited to their parties. And you also invited people that were your clients. Why did you invite your clients? Well, this is just part of the system. So you're telling your clients, hey, I'm going to introduce you to my patron. And you're telling your patron, hey, I got more clients for you. What can the client do for the patron? I mean, the patron's the one with the power in this relationship. The power dynamic is on the patron side. So what the client's responsibility is to help bring honor to the patron by speaking well of your patron in the community, by defending your patron's reputation, and by doing that, you added. So the more clients I got talking about what a great guy I am, the more honor is assigned to me by the community. You see how all this honor, shame, patronage, all that stuff all fits together.
We call those referrals.
Call those referrals in the insurance business? Yeah, so we have we have some of these things, like you make a connection, you want business connections if you're in business, right? But this is like in every relationship. And so you would receive and gain honor based on who your patrons were and based on who your clients were. So back to the centurion. The centurion is a public patron. He is a benefactor of the Jews. And he's got this servant that he really cares for. This is a valuable servant. And he hears Jesus is coming. He's like, man, I don't have access to this guy. For one thing, I'm not a Jew. I can't just go up to this rabbi and ask him to do this. So he gets some prominent Jews. And he probably leads off with something like, everything okay at the synagogue I built? Hey, listen, I've got this servant that's sick, and I hear this Jesus can heal people. Would you mind making that connection for me and asking him to heal my servant? Their response is going to be, oh, you are such an honorable person and worthy of honor. We would be happy to do this for you. Now, bear in mind, these synagogue rulers probably didn't think much of Jesus. So they go to Jesus on his behalf. So this is what's going on here. He sends some of his clients to Jesus to make the connection. So now, Jesus is headed his way, and he hears, hey, Jesus is coming, and he's like, he doesn't need to do that. So now he sends friends. Well, what are the friends? The friends are also clients. So he's got some Jews that he hasn't, this is not because of the synagogue or he's done anything, but he's built relationships with them where they're making introductions. So he says, listen, you're one of my friends. Can you go to him and just give him this message? So they go give Jesus this message. And by the way, do you notice here's a positive honor challenge? You don't need to do this. I'm a man in authority. You have authority. All you have to do is say the word and it will be done. So now, I mean, he's not trying to trap Jesus, but now Jesus is on the spot with an honor challenge. And what does Jesus do? He doesn't say, okay, he's healed. Jesus says, I wish you Jewish people had that kind of faith. And sure enough, the guy's healed. So word's getting around. Now Jesus is increasing in honor in Capernaum. So when you read the New Testament, you see a lot of this purity. You see people who are clean, unclean. I want you to be able to see what a big deal it is when Jesus is interacting with people who have no honor in the community, when Jesus is interacting with the tax collectors and recruiting him to be one of his inner circle. When Jesus is talking to women because you didn't do that. When Jesus is interacting with a Syrophoenician woman whose daughter is demon-possessed, when Jesus is interacting with a woman who is bleeding, which, by the way, was unclean, this is a big, big deal. Jesus is flipping everything in their culture on its head. He walks on the scene. I want you to be able to see why people are just so, they don't know what to do with this guy. He's coming on the scene as the rabbi, making these claims. He's backing them all up, but he's not playing by their rules. In fact, he's turning every rule upside down. I'm just going to tell you, I don't know how it worked, but in Luke chapter 5, this leper that comes to him, you know, the Pharisees has actually told people it's a sin to look at a leper or to speak to a leper. You're not allowed to speak to him. People didn't look at him because they were grotesque. Jesus looks at him, speaks to him, touches him. And in my mind, I don't know what that looked like. But in my mind, I just see Jesus going, come here, brother. And the people standing around, because when a leper walks up, everybody's going to start backing away. And I can see the people just going, what is he doing? And suddenly this guy's whole again. I mean, it's astounding. So I want you to be looking. When you see words clean and unclean, honor, shame, when you see Jesus' interactions, by the way, one thing I forgot to mention about the honor challenge. If you issue a challenge, the person brings the riposte, there needs to be a response to that. How many times do we read that after Jesus did this, they could not answer him? So it's up to the bystanders to decide who won, unless you're left speechless. You lose. If you don't have a response, you lose. There's no discussion. The people don't have to go, what do you think about that? It's just a done deal. You have lost. You've been skunked. It's a slam dunk right over your head. No debate, no discussion. And Jesus regularly is responding to the challenges in ways that they just go. I mean, how do they respond? Hey, you untie your yoke and ox, why can't I untie this woman? What are they going to say? Well, they don't have anything to say. They were shamed. I mean, these guys would have just scooted out and gone home. Remember, these are all interconnected, and golly, it's already 7:18. We're gonna punt till next week. I've got another brief thing, but we'll do that next week. I'll let you go. I just get so worked up about this stuff. I think it's really cool. And anyway, no, I got to let you go. People got kids and stuff, and so I want to honor your time. I would rather quit with you wanting more than keep going when you're done listening. And I've done that before too. So let's just pray and we'll wrap up for tonight. Father, we're just so thankful that Jesus cares about the unclean and the disgraced and the outcast. Because according to your word, that's what we all were. But that he looks at us and he speaks to us and he touches us. God, I pray that everything we do and talk about here just helps us to love Jesus more. So fill our hearts with that love, we pray in Jesus' name. Amen. Thank you all for being here.